So I thought originally I was envisioned writing this sermon and kind of creating a space. I was going to put like a cover over it and a comfy chair. I really kind of wanted to create kind of a sense of intimacy. And then, as I started to write the sermon, I realized we can't have intimacy in that way anymore, not a public way, so that the image was wrong. And then I decided I'd switch it to a socially distant walk around the theological supermarket of the West. And so I thought, that was my gimmick, and that was fun. So, my history gravitates to probably deconstruction of theology as much as adoration, although I participate in both, I think. And so I thought that I would just kind of lay out theology and we'd see where we followed up with that. So, and our first step in our theological walk around, I thought we'd start with what I'd like to call Enlightened Agnosticism. And Enlightened Agnosticism, to me, agnosticism is formally not having an opinion on God, right? God's existence. But I think Enlightened Agnosticism is the idea that, the reality that we're all in over our heads about this question. And, regardless of what you believe or don't believe regarding the meaning of life, more than indifference, this spot just declares that simple sort of human truth for me, that faithful or not, we all experience moments of wonder, and we all experience moments of the fear of death, and we all stand sort of somewhat blind to the truth of what we face, some of us with greater senses of conviction than others. The question of God is, to me, personally, permanently, perennially fuzzy. And I say that because as I proceed to walk through these, I'll sort of embrace a kind of conviction of each of them. But I like to begin by just saying nobody really knows what they're talking about exactly when it comes to God. And, people have different varies of commitment on that. But sometimes that can be intimidating when we hear the more faithful people or the more angry, of those who are opposed to those ideas. On our tour, I think the next stop from agnosticism naturally should be atheism. Many of the people who stand in the spot, we'll call it here, of being an atheist, simply don't believe in God. Some others have more of a passionate conviction of that. People here generally tend to think that science has answered, largely at least, some of the questions religions have postulated incorrect answers to for eons, and found no God behind any of those questions. For what it's worth, I think they're probably right. Those who stop on this square or that little spot you might see at Trader Joe's or Stop and Shop or whatever, some have more energy than others, and some, want to just be done with the idea that there's an imaginary personality who cares, judges, created everything, and believe that we philosophically really need to move on from ideas that were postulated by less advanced minds from thousands of years ago. Many of those who stop here vividly share the truth that God has been used by the powerful to oppress people since the moments we started settling down in civilizations. Spiritual and ethical atheists want to remind us that creating justice is really what we need to do, and extending and improving our lives via science. This group might even appropriately want to caution that the soft validation that comes from all of the pro-God affirming people is that, that God is behind all the good stuff you feel. They want to warn you that that's not true. Some people, at least. People in this spot might say, watch out, I bet you're going to hear arguments about how all of this wouldn't be if it were not part of some grand plan caused by some creator. Atheists tend to think that, as you probably know, that theists miss that although nobody was here to report on all the failed universes that never got started, although that's, the argument that we wouldn't be here without it is part of that deal. So I want to honor that. I want to honor, for most atheists, this doesn't mean you're not called to a spiritual or an ethical life. In fact, the idea that there's not a parent God governing history and managing our lives is actually more of a reason to live an intentional life. And those that stop on this location and live from here often argue that the reason that religions are retreating from being the organizations that hold sway in our society is quite simply because they're wrong. So as a UU, I don't need to tell you that you were invited to live from here. I half live from this spot myself. If you move to the next spot in your supermarket, you'd have sort of reasons why people do believe in God. About 70% of Americans claim a belief in God, largely depending loosely on how loosely you describe it. Many UUs do as well. As I alluded to in the introduction, people believe or don't believe in supernatural things for any number of reasons, most of them unconscious, right? Our beliefs come from places we can't even evaluate. And what defines that predisposition is even hard to know. However, the arguments for God are generally pretty clear. Philosophically, God has been conceived of and defended in a number of predictable ways. Here's a few of them. Step 3, we'll call it, over here in one of the social distancing spaces, is the history of tradition and the religion and the history and of all the validation that comes out of primarily the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic scriptures I'm thinking of, and all the traditions. Think about this. These faiths provide a legacy of belief that dates back almost 4,000 years. Notably, the 4 smartest millennia in human history is when we came up with the idea of there being a singular God. People here want to remind us about half the humans who've ever set foot on the planet, half the Homo sapiens, have believed in one God. From Abraham to Moses, from Muhammad to Mother Teresa, there have been thousands of martyrs and billions of people who've felt touched by God, felt God spoke to them in particularly unique ways. People have experienced near-death experiences, have had psychic experiences, have had remarkable experiences attributable to God. And so from here, you have to ask that question and are asked, could all the books, could all the revelations all be wrong, delusional, misguided, simply the place and history of our tradition? What are the chances of that? The next sort of validation of God, you move over into this spot, the next reason one would believe in a God, on our next little 4-spot marker guide, would be the compelling logical sense that everything starts with something and is motivated by other things and pushed forward by other things. We're born of human beings. Everything touches with something, and so naturally did the universe. Aristotle, way back in the day, famously articulated the idea that since things are always created by other things, there's always a first cause, there's always an unmoved mover. Those here say he's right. He's on to a primary and fundamental truth. Those who stand here ask us to look at the order inherent in this beautiful garden, how things work, the way things function, and ask if the spherical things you see in seashells and ecosystems, could it all really be a big mistake? From this spot, only the blind, they would say, and the hard-hearted can't see that there's a design built into creation, a beauty and a purpose built into things. Sure, this group might say, and we hopefully willing to admit, that we always get the story of the supernatural a little bit wrong. We always tell it from our own historical bias. No doubt we still do, but just because science hasn't found a God at the end of the Big Bang or at the start of the Big Bang doesn't mean there isn't one. Quite simply, the universe makes more sense if it has a push, a creator, a God. Similar to Aristotle, Anselm, back in the Middle Ages, offered up the argument that because the idea of a being none greater than God can be conceived of, there's a certain truth to that. That's a bolder claim than most, sort of philosophically people would make today. But people standing here at least suggest we probably wouldn't think of the idea of God so persistently if it were not true. And that idea brings us to the next step, which is that for so long, historically, outside of faith, in almost every faith, there is a sense that there's another realm, right? There's a force planted in our mind that is God, but there's also a realm we can't quite see, right? Plato talked about it. All the faiths talk about, whether it's an animist, misinterpreting that there's a jaguar God, there's a sense that something is true that we can't fully grasp, that this isn't really the only world. Standing on this spot in the store of religious options that we have, we find a God that is sensed but untouchable, right? St. Augustine's words apply. He says, if you can understand it, it's not God. And he went on to say that I can't say what God is, yet I know in my soul that God is, and that God is known by many names, yet not fully known by any name. William Wordsworth, you might be familiar with Tintern Abbey. He talks about this kind of thing in just these poetic terms. He says, a sense sublime of something far more deeply infused, emotion, and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of thought, and rolls through all things. Okay, that's not philosophically a proof by any means. You can't put that in your basket and essentially defend it. But what these people in this spot in our little theological supermarket say is that finding God is a little bit less like grasping or winning an argument. It's a little more like the inherent beauty in one of Michael's pieces, right? There's a soft beauty in there, and it takes a little bit of practice to feel it. It takes a little bit of faith to see the truth of God. Seeing God takes a little bit of our own energy to get there. One of the parishioners in California said that she would describe herself as an agnostic. She also said that she sensed that God was most available in the compassionate way the wind blows. No, she didn't say that. She said that it was in the compassionate things people do for one another, and that God may not only be felt mystically, but as the source of the best of our motivations. God is there in our call to justice and to compassion and empathy, and is fundamentally at the core of the source of poetry and music. I think that's really beautiful. If you stop there, you might be faithful. You could stop at any one of these, right, and kind of agree with a lot of what the sentiment is. It's interesting to see how different they are and how much you can resonate with all of them. Here's some challenges that God faces. Take a few steps away from those warm and fuzzy things, and you realize that there's some problems with what's testified to being the truth. One of the struggles we have in believing God to be real is that now that we see the full breadth of humanity and we see the full scope of the universe, God has to be bigger than we ever conceived of in the way that we wrote about God before. God's almost ungraspable. And yet, as Reverend Wickstrom, a UU service down the Cape, said, there's a natural tension. We want God to be as close as our breath to us as well, right? God must be personal, love us, care for us, maybe heal us, be approachable, and then God must be the source of a 14 billion year old creation so big you can't grasp it. That very idea that God must be both those things challenges the very notion that God is real and alive and well. Stretches credibility, you might say. Another critique of God in our little version here is the idea that God is on our side, that God is good, right? We hear that. God is good and all-powerful. God's the creator. And then we have that classic question of why is there so much suffering and pain in the world? It doesn't add up. Why would an all-powerful, all-good God create an imperfect world driven so much by chance and competition as compassion, driven so much by blood and guts and ruthlessness as by love and justice? that doesn't add up either. And the third challenge to God's existence is even simpler. It's that there isn't one piece of hard evidence anywhere that God actually exists. Nothing. It all could be culturally informed, subjective, wishful thinking, dreamed up by an emotionally vulnerable, very smart creature in search of answers and afraid of where they stand on the edge of a spinning planet in a universe. Those three hurdles might be laid out pretty quickly, but they're all pretty efficiently. Their brevity might speak to their clarity, is another way to say that. But there's another side of the God question, and that's what faith does, right? Any religion mostly isn't necessarily successful based on what its philosophical principles are. It's based on what it does for us and how it eases our pain and comforts us and serves us. The impact and function of religion is more important, one could argue, than its logical cohesion. Now let's for a moment separate the question of whether we believe in God to the question of what God does for us. Theologians remind us that the symbol of God can serve several important functions. Again, St. Augustine. He wrote that living with the experience of God offers us a richer sense of the world and a larger sense of time than we would otherwise live with. I think that's sort of beautiful and true. It's hardly a philosophical argument, of course, but I've worked to, I don't really believe in the God of my youth, at least, but I've also held on to the God of purpose in an illogical, almost hypocritical way. And looking at it functionally on a sociological, moral level, the understanding that so many people, false or correct, believe that God is there to partner with them, to guide them, to strengthen their concern for their ethics, to guide people to moral behavior, striving to please God, delusional or not, as an act. Those who are primarily humanists, we need to honor how valuable that is for a world, particularly for people more vulnerable than most of us are. But even then, all of us are vulnerable. I've certainly felt my Christian and UU roots, with its emphasis on love and on service and morality, helps me to confront the kind of wisdom of the world of consumerism and self-interest that I'm constantly confronted with. It provides a finger in the dam of, selfish behavior. It helps me, my faith helps me be more active, less racist, concerned for the planet, less concerned for myself, maybe even a better minister. God can serve as a standard to measure yourself by that's outside yourself and can compel you to the nitty-gritty work of loving one another, creating economic justice. It's a different standard. A faith in God can also offer perspective, right or wrong, God being true or not true. It's appropriate to have a certain humility to your role in terms of your relationship to creation, right? Where the most amazing creatures we're aware of in the universe, the smartest things running around, and yet we're also fragile and finite, and God can help keep us in that perspective place. And finally, God functionally brings together the highest ideals into one single symbol, right? God's really useful that way. If we were to divide up all of our instincts for good and bad without there being a God, it would be clumsier to think about that. To me, the idea that there's a universal architect who creates order and cares about us is the most amazing, best idea there's ever been. I grew up with that idea, and to about 20 probably would have called myself a believer in a pretty authentic way. I don't believe that such a force exists, or that such a personality is really approachable, but the persistence of faith is no mystery to me. And I think that lands us back again in our spacing ourselves to that kind of agnosticism that leads us to maybe a humility that we don't know the answers to any of these questions, and that we can maybe honor all of the little positions that we've had. So